is one of those things is revisiting the carnival. So
So I don't know how many folks have joined us. If any have, there's a question in the chat that we'd like folks to answer as we go along here. What do you think should be the motivation behind seeking information the public has a right to know? What is the motivation? And we'll get started in a few minutes. So while we're chatting, it's just the carnival. Can somebody explain that to me?
the Carnival of Journalism, the version I came in on was one where David Cohn was doing his RJI fellowship. And so he used it as an organizing mechanism for an event he held during his fellowship, looking at a group of us called Hardly Strictly Young, of which I was the Hardly. I'm part of the Hardly portion of that group. So there were a bunch of us who got a chance to revisit the Knight Commission on Information Needs and offer a different set of thoughts about it. And as a result, though, the carnival kept going until it didn't. And then I actually went out and bought the domain because somebody didn't buy the domain. And so we actually have the domain.
Oh,
And the long-term goal is to actually port all the old Carnival journalism stuff onto that site and restart the Carnival journalism. So it's like a blog carnival. So once a month, there's a prompt, normally from somebody within the journalism industry. And then you normally have about 2 weeks to think of something to write about, 2.5 weeks. And then we all just, somebody just puts together a list of everybody who decided to write something, and it leads to some, it led to some great conversations.
oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right. So if anyone has joined us, there is a question that we posted in the chat, and we would like for folks to share what they're thinking. That question is, what do you think should be the motivation behind seeking information that the public has a right to know? What are the reasons that we should be seeking information the public has a right to know? We'll get started in about 2 minutes. Ah, cool. I see we're getting some answers. Ensuring the government is representative. Electoral choices based on full information to shed light on government conduct. Democratic accountability. Wow, we've got a good crowd here too. This was great. Evidence-based evaluation of political claims. This is interesting because I think some of these answers are going to be will actually challenge a few of these answers. So if you're just signing on, there's a question and we want everyone to answer it in the chat. And I'm looking forward to reading all these and compiling them. What do you think should be the motivation behind seeking information that the public has a right to know? What should motivate us? All right. So this is great. I don't think there has to be a reason. Some people have very personal reasons for needing government information. Cool. Motivations will differ from person to person. Okay. So I'm going to get us started here. And just keep going here, answering that question if you want. But for the sake of time, I'm Doug Oplinger. I'm a 51-year journalist, and that encompasses a lot of time. If you want to know what that encompasses, just check the short bio there. But needless to say, that goes back a long ways, actually to the early days of Ohio's Sunshine Law and the movement across the country to shed light on what governments do, the transparency movement. And you know, in my early days, in 1971, as a reporter at age 19, I was covering a local school board that just refused to meet in public. They'd meet behind closed doors and then come out and just rubber stamp over and over. And I was sick of it. So rather than sit there behind the door, I went outside the building at dark, it's cold, went around the building, found the room where they were meeting, and pasted a listening device onto the glass and acted like I'm hearing what they're saying and I'm taking notes. And it's like, oh, can he do that? Well, actually I couldn't, but it so aggravated them. One board member called me a troublemaking whippersnapper, which is an accusation that still stings to this day, 51 years later. I wasn't able to hear, but what I did actually caused one of the board members such embarrassment that they became a source and told me everything that went on in there. I guess that's one way of getting public information, but it shouldn't be that hard. Several years later, I was a business reporter, and a corporate source at a Fortune 500 tire company in Akron told me he had photocopied corporate information, testing data that showed that their tires were failing prematurely and possibly causing injuries. And he said, if you want those records, like, yeah, he said, and here's what he told me. Here's the quote. Meet me at high noon in the alley behind My Joe's house of Paprikash. And that's exactly what happened. And I got a package of documents that ended up in the recall of 11 million Firestone tires over the next few years. Those were proprietary records. They were not public information, which begins to move us in a direction I want to go. Today's question is provocative. The public's right to know. Does accurate information reduce political polarization? Well, I want to ask all kinds of probing questions about that of the panel here, and I'll have them introduce themselves in just a minute. When we talk about the public's right to know, all of us in this group, and journalists in particular, I like to ask, to know what? Who's deciding the reasons that this information is needed, that the public needs this? What information aren't we asking? Are we doing this to expose, to investigate? What about trying to help? Do we ever try to help? And is our infatuation with public records a distraction from the records maybe the public really needs to see, like that tire data? And another question, a question for this panel to be thinking about is, this panel had a meeting last week, and in our collective memories, the reporters that we know who always asked for data and did the analysis were all white men. What's the result of that? And the data that we get in Ohio invariably tells Ohioans, your life sucks. Ohio is in a tailspin and you're with it. What good does that do to a public that is clamoring for answers on how do I make things better? So those are things to be thinking about when we talk about the use of public data, public information, or just information the public needs to know. So I'm going to ask folks to introduce themselves because this is a fascinating group with very different approaches. And I'll ask Amelia first to just introduce yourself to the group.
And I'm the opinion and community engagement editor for the Columbus Dispatch. I've been a journalist for about 25 years. I'm getting pretty old. So I've, requested many public records in my career, and I am a believer that the public has the right to know, and also we have a responsibility to know. We have a responsibility to, get the records that will help us inform decisions, and also to challenge the government when need be. So that's just a little bit about me.
All right, thank you. Andre?
Hello, everybody. My name is Andre Natta. I am currently the collaborations editor at Muckrock, which is a platform that helps make it easier to go ahead and make all this information transparent and available to the general public. This is my second stint in journalism. The first one didn't last very long. This one's been about 16 years. And I'm a former economic development professional, both in Georgia and in Alabama. I'm currently based in Birmingham, Alabama. And aside from that, I do a bunch of crazy things in journalism. Among those, I serve as the board chair for the Tiny News Collective, which is a nonprofit that helps solopreneurs and 2-3 person newsrooms get started. And one of the things that is of importance for them involves how can they get into providing public records in a reasonable way, in a way that allows them to work with the assets and resources that they have. So that's about me. Thanks for having me.
All right, thanks, Andre. And Jackie?
Hi, I'm Jackie Borchert. I'm the Senior News Director for Content at the Cincinnati Enquirer. So in my current role, I help reporters form records requests. I coach them on records requests, and I'm in quite a few meetings with our legal counsel as we are very aggressive in challenging denials and exemptions to our state records law. So most of my experience has been with Ohio's public records law, more so than the federal FOIA. I've been in this role for about a year, and before that, I covered state government and politics in Ohio. So I filed a lot of records requests, did a lot of back and forth with state officials, arguing to get the records that I was seeking. Sometimes having really great exchanges with those state officials, but more often than not, getting a lot of pushback and trying to stand firm and get the information that we were seeking. And in my last role on that beat, I was the bureau chief for Gannett's 21 daily news organizations covering state government.
Okay, thank you. And we'll start with you, Jackie, because you really represent what the traditional legacy mainstream media is doing today, and have for the last few years as an extraordinary reporter covering the State House and really holding folks accountable. Can you talk for a minute about some of the requests that your news organization has made in Ohio regarding COVID and overdose deaths and where that's gone?
Yeah, so as for up until last year, I was the main statewide COVID reporter for the Bureau, and we filed a lot of records requests. And going back to 2020, in the early days of the pandemic, we didn't know much at all, if anything, but we did know that the coronavirus was affecting elderly people especially. And so reporters at the Enquirer and the Columbus Dispatch, who we had merged under the merged Gatehouse, but not merged our actual team. So we had 2 teams of reporters still covering it pretty extensively. We both put in separate records requests for information about the coronavirus related deaths at the state's nursing homes, assisted living facilities, and long-term care facilities. And the governor's office and his Department of Health that reports up to him had promised they would get that information out, but we filed the record request anyway for a database of death certificates, essentially. The Ohio Department of Health houses all of that information in a database that's used for, I don't know, it has really unlimited uses. And the way that we in Ohio have used it traditionally, journalists have used it, was to track overdose deaths in near real time, because the state would report some numbers annually, but those of course come out months after a year ends. And so I remember we were using that, 5 and 6 years ago to see whether, is this year worse than last year? Are we on track to exceed last year? With the huge caveat that death certificates in Ohio, medical examiners have up to 6 months to file those. So recognizing this is preliminary data and we're already worse than we were last year, that was kind of the stories that we had been writing from that data. So we requested that data, and that shows everything that's on a death certificate. So it's the person's name, the address where they resided, where they died, their cause of death, all of that information. And the Ohio Department of Health slow walked us like they did on all of our COVID requests, because were getting such a huge volume of requests. And they initially put out some data on the number of deaths in nursing homes by facility, but they didn't release the assisted living numbers or any other extra numbers. So we still had this issue where the state had released some data, but it wasn't what we were seeking. And it really didn't paint a complete picture of, which facilities were, hotspots, which ones had, maybe they had a bunch of deaths early on the pandemic and they turned things around and they were fine later. I mean, there were lots of different ways that we wanted to look at that data and draw some conclusions. But we were not provided that data. We were provided with a partial set. And at that point, we decided to file a complaint. And in Ohio, we have a pretty new and also a pretty great system for challenging public records denials. And it's through the State Court of Claims, which handles complaints and lawsuits against state agencies. So we filed a complaint there, and we got an initial favorable ruling that this information was essentially what you get in a death certificate, which is public record in Ohio. I can, go to the coroner's office and request a death certificate, and they will produce it for me. So the Department of Health challenged that, and it landed in an appellate court, and we just got a decision on that a couple weeks ago. So this was a complaint that was filed now more than 2 years ago. And we just finally got an appellate decision, which we are going to challenge to the Ohio Supreme Court.
So something that journalists had gotten routinely, suddenly the state stopped providing. Interestingly, just as statewide elections are coming around, and there are rumors that overdose deaths are surging to even the highest record, and Ohio has always been among the top 4 for overdose deaths per capita. And there's lingering concerns about old people dying of COVID. So what were you hoping that the public, how was this going to serve the public if you were able to say, hey folks, here's how you're dying?
Well, I think at the beginning, we were getting a lot of requests actually from readers and members of the public. I mean, on a number of things, asking us because there's such an information void, and we had a direct line to the governor's office and a daily press conference and the health department. So we got all sorts of questions and requests. And one that we kept getting was, from families that had loved ones in these facilities, and they felt like they didn't know. They wanted to know if their loved one was safe, if there was an outbreak at the facility. And we just did not have that data in those initial, probably I think month and a half. And even when it came out, it wasn't, there were issues with it. Like I said, it was incomplete. It didn't have the assisted living centers or the long-term care facilities. So, we were hoping, I think initially, to help provide information that would help people make decisions about what to do with their loved ones. And at that time, we didn't really know much. And a lot of people were considering, should I remove my mother from this nursing home and take her home with me? And so that was, I think, our initial hope. And then as we saw that the staggering number, proportion of deaths were happening in that older population, there's an accountability piece to that. So we were able to get some information throughout the pandemic about from the National Centers for Medicare and Medicaid on their investigations, and they then posted numbers, but only for nursing homes again. And really, it was a broader issue than that.
Okay, all right. Thank you. And this is a pretty clear example of how data can help people make decisions. Not just regular folks, but even local governments in looking at what we have and be informed in making policy decisions. There has been a lot in the chat about holding government accountable, exposing corruption. And I want to push back on that just a minute as we go to Andre. I worry that since Watergate, for example, there has been this attention to exposing corruption. And by exposing fault over and over, what does that tell the public? And one of my mentors at the Kettering Foundation, David Holwork, did a chart that showed that as transparency improved with government and institutions, trust in every institution went down. So is there a relationship there? Is there a problem with the exposure of fault creating a feeling that nothing is working? And Andre is working with an idea. Andre's had time to be on the mountaintop, everybody. I want you to know that. He's done some serious thinking with the Knight Foundation at Stanford and at the Lenfest Institute. And he's thinking about how do we use records and data in a way that, well, Andre, you talk about it.
Well, I think that what Tom just put in the Zoom chat might sum it up. It's like the goal isn't trust at the expense of honesty and integrity. The goal is to make sure that people have actionable information to be able to participate in their society. But that also means that we have to provide context for that data. A lot of times when we do put data out, even when we do put context in, it is not necessarily, it's a very broad overview of context because we're trying to just feed the beast nowadays. We have to find ways to kind of make it right-sized for the individual communities and figure out how people can see, oh, this is happening in this community and it's bad. What are the other factors that are playing into it? Are there ways to go ahead and leverage that data that is public and is accessible to then figure out where those gaps are and build off of it? So it's very much trying to speak with a community, because many times the best way to get that information is to talk to the folks you should be talking to anyway, and not wait until after the fact to go ahead and speak to them. You really need to think about, if something good is going on, how do you go ahead and highlight that? If people think something good is going on and the data says, well, it's kind of wishy-washy, let's go ahead and complicate that narrative. Let's go ahead and make it so that people truly understand that it's not a binary issue going on. People need to be a bit more trusted than I think we've let them, or that we think that they, well, I mean, we need to trust them more than we have in recent years. Even when you look at, like right now, is the data driving the journalism, or is the journalism playing off the data? And that is an important thing to keep in mind. I think even as we're in an election year, what data are you using? What are you leveraging? How is that playing into how people do feel?
Yeah, that's a great point. That often I would see journalists look at the data and say, here's the story, now let's go out and find someone to represent it.
Yeah.
So talk to me some about how you might recommend that be done differently.
Well, ironically, the first thing to do is to get data. It's and that this kind of comes from my days in economic development. You don't most times even for all and how messy it can get, even when you're doing an economic development assessment, you're doing an assessment. You're going out there and you know exactly what each building's condition is, you know who's in the building, you know how long they've been in the building, you know all these different factors that you're then trying to go and leverage and understand. But an additional layer for journalism is you understand income levels, issues regarding what's going on in their schools. And you're actually going in and talking to people on a regular basis. You are not, if making it something so that you can slow down that news cycle, and really get some context to go and play with early on. So that you're not just like I said earlier, you are not just showing up at the last minute. And then when you do make that request for that data, when it comes in, it makes it easier to kind of parse out, oh, well, the community thinks this, but the data says this. And you can kind of broker an understanding about what's happening. Or you can say, yeah, it actually is pretty bad. And let's have a conversation about what's going on and ways that are already being worked on. I think a lot of times we'll go in like 2-3 days after and find a solution that's already going on. And we don't really think about, well, what if they've already been trying? And what if they're the ones who actually drove us to do this, to go and do this reporting in the first place? It's just as bad to parachute into your own town as it is to let somebody else come in and parachute into your community. And the need to go ahead and leverage good empirical data and understanding what's going on to the point where I am a naive fool in having probably been on the other side of this, thinking that having that relationship up front means that some of that adversarial stuff that happens, not all the time, because sometimes that's just going to happen, but sometimes it might make it a little less dicey and make it so that they know you're not just coming to go ahead and make them look bad again. Because to your point at the beginning, before asking me questions, that is true. If you keep pointing out the fact that things are going on badly, and I'll also add, badly for who? Badly for who? Because the lens that you take should be the lens of the community that you're serving. And that should also have an impact on how you get that information to them in the first place. So I think that data drives how you do those stories, whether you're going to go ahead and print something, do a mural, do a storytelling session, leverage audio, do something in public. It is more thinking about how that plays into the role as well. Data is pretty powerful. And I don't think we use it nearly as much as we should.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you a question that's going to allow us to bridge to Amelia, and that is, so you've equipped yourself with conversations with people, and you've equipped yourself with data. As I have talked with journalists about using that to hold public officials accountable, there are journalists who say that's advocacy journalism. Our job is just to cover what government does. What are your thoughts on this idea of listening and doing the research and saying to public officials, we're going to hold you to this agenda? Is that advocacy journalism, or is it doing our work? Right? No, I'm not going to make that binary. What do you think about that question?
I was going to say, I think it depends. I think it depends, which is a bad answer to give. But I do think that the majority of the time, though, it is not advocacy journalism. Because you're serving a really quick story. A couple jobs ago, a reporter came to me talking about them not giving an answer, and you can tell the hair is gone In part because I tend to get worked up and the hands get moving, and I just went off. I was like, it is not them. It is not us versus them. It is we. We are in this community together. We have to go ahead and do what is right for this community. If our job is to call, our job is as much to call balls and strikes as it is to go ahead and shine a light on them always doing something bad. And it is not always government. It is nonprofit organizations, it is churches, it is communities, it is all of that stuff. So if we limit ourselves to that Watergate-esque definition of what it means, you're limiting what we can do. And maybe that's capital J journalism, but journalism as a general movement, I'll say, needs to be mindful of who we actually are trying to get the information out to.
Yeah, okay. So as we move to Amelia, I just posted another question for you to think about. And this is something that I think will, I hope, generate some responses that people want to save links and references to do their own research. But what I'm asking is, have you seen news organizations, media outlets pursue public information in a way that was provocative to you, positively or negatively? Where did you see this attempt to get access of information and to expose it? Where did you see it do public good, and where did you see it do harm? So anything you can add there to help us think about what does look good in particular, what are solutions, what are paths journalists might want to take, that would really be helpful. So as you're thinking about that, I want to turn to Amelia, and Amelia explained that she was the regular beat reporter for a while. She did some incredible narrative work at the Dayton Daily News, bringing life to community and people that kind of moved her in an interesting direction, so that she went to the Columbus Dispatch and is now dealing with engagement, in which she is listening to people and thinking about what are their needs? What do we need to be paying attention to? So I'm going to stop and ask Amelia. So first of all, give us your experience, the time that you were participating in Ohio's Open Records Day, when you were going around. What was that about? What happened to you?
Oh, it was Ohio Records Day, where newspapers around the state teamed up, and I think it was a couple of days actually. We went out and tried to get records from various government agencies of various sizes. I went to a particularly small police department in one of our suburban areas, and I was basically heard my name. I went back to the office, and they said your car and your name came over the radio. Like, they heard them check my records, which was against the law. So there was actually a highway patrol investigations, because you're not supposed to just look up people's records. It traced back to the Dayton Daily News staff car. So, I feel like they, wonder why this Black woman came into the police department asking for records, is what I got from the whole experience. And, as journalists, we routinely go into buildings and spaces and ask for stuff because we feel like we deserve them, because, and for the most part, they'll give it to us. But as a regular citizen, sometimes folks have a harder time. And that kind of illustrates that point that, there is a difference. And to me, that came through that day.
How did that affect you?
Oh, it made me very sad and angry actually that you would do that. Because if I wasn't a journalist, in that case, those folks, I wasn't a journalist, how would regular people be treated when they're trying to get records that they have every right to see? It was basically like, I can't remember what the record was, but it was a very simple record that anybody should have access to. It wasn't even a police department, it was a city hall kind of situation. It wasn't a police department, but they called over to the police department to check it out. So like it made me, it grounded me in that I do have like a little bit more power than most folks because I do have I'm a journalist. And it made me sad because I don't want anybody to experience that. Nobody should.
Was this a white community and white police
Oh
department?
yeah, it was a very I have eaten at the restaurants. Like we go, it's one of those places you go and have a there's a famous restaurant there that people go to. So I have visited the place before, but it's a very white community.
Okay, so I'm going to throw you a question we didn't talk about previously. And that is that, and you were a police reporter in Dayton, I believe?
I was a police
Okay.
reporter.
So it is a tendency of major news organizations to cover the largest police department. And the news organizations have that police department trained. We're coming in, and so are the others. Show us the booking log or whatever, and we're going to write our stories from that. And that we should get the reports, and we'll go to court to get them. But like Dayton and Akron and Baltimore and Philadelphia, there are scores of suburbs. And as resources diminish, how many of those white suburban communities get a phone call or a visit from a reporter that trains them to release information and actually get covered when crime occurs? Is this an example of how access to public records creates divides, creates misconceptions? Talk to me a minute about that.
Well, that made me think of the fact that, the Dayton Police Department or the Columbus Police Department, they're trained to give you the records, right? And a lot of times they have databases that you can actually search. You don't actually have to go up to the window and ask for the records. But a lot of the smaller departments, they have a very much different approach to giving you records. They'll do lots of things to make it hard for you to even see basic reports, which is a lot of times why you see on TV news more reports of this from the cities, the major cities, than you ever would see in the suburbs. And that doesn't mean there's no crime in the suburbs. That just means that cities make it so much easier for reporters to get records than suburban areas. For instance, I covered Beaver Creek. I've covered Beaver Creek, Ohio, which is a small suburb of Dayton in Greene County. And they didn't make the records really available. You had to ask for it, and you had to go wait for the detective, and there's a whole different process. So that's just another kind of tactic that smaller places use. And a lot of times media does not push back because they figure, oh, that's just a small place. But when it comes down to protecting the public, we have an obligation to do that. We just sometimes don't. So anyway, I ran it a little bit. But.
So I'll open this to everybody. Is there a problem with certain public records or certain agencies being a shiny object, easy to access and get stories? But then they drag us out, or drag Jackie's organization out on the big ones to prevent us from doing the harder work. Is there an issue in that causing divides in our communities and adversely affecting the way we do journalism?
Yeah, I think you kind of asked it in a way where you already answered the question. I think it does do that. I think it is. I think it makes it inherently hard to go out and be a watchdog in terms of that part of the job. And at that point, that's where it gets back to sort of a side benefit of being in the community before. If you can be in that community and they know something's wrong and they can go ahead and saber rattle, it makes it a little easier for the smaller organizations to go into those smaller towns to go out and get access to that information. otherwise, yeah, it's a perception that, I mean, I saw it here. I saw it here while doing economic development in Alabama. The data that was out, the reporting that was out made you think one thing about a city because of how they were labeling one section of the city, but they weren't labeling it properly, versus some of the suburbs are getting just as much stuff, if not more, in some categories.
Yeah, yeah.
But your resources have gone down, and now you're like, well, I have to go out. This is going to be the easier story to getting back to that feeding the beast type
Hmm.
thing. So yeah, I think it makes it tougher to go out and truly make people aware of what is going on and the true nature of what's going on.
Yeah. Okay. So for the sake of time, go ahead, Jackie. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, because Andre mentioned, dwindling resources and taking the easier piece as extremely tempting, especially in a digital news environment and where you're competing with TV, because that's what they do. And it's very easy to do that too. But we've kind of taken the opposite approach in we have fewer feet on the street. We can't get to every police department. And so we always are looking for trends. And when we look for trends, we don't do just the city of Cincinnati. We go broader than that because it would show a skewed picture in a lot of different areas. And just a real quick example, earlier this year, over the summer and the early spring, we were getting, there were a lot of like individual reports of crime happening and, certain crimes, assaults and things happening. And if you had only watched TV, you would think, wow, crime is really, really up in the city. It's terrible. And we got reader emails to me, hey, why aren't you guys reporting on all this crime? It's terrible. There's a huge spike in crime. And we had one of our public safety reporters, well, he's been tracking it. And at that point, he stopped and wrote a story about how there was not a huge spike in crime, that actually crime was at about 2019 levels in most parts of the region. So, kind of busting that narrative, but that's not a story that we would have been able to do if we had been still trying to like chase all the little things everywhere. And we would have been giving off that false perception that there is a spike in crime.
And it feeds division in our nation too when we do it, which is why I'm glad that Gannett and USA Today has, our network has taken a different approach to covering crime in general, to not tell a false story to communities about each other, because we're all like Andre said, we're one thing, right? So it's like you completely mischaracterize what's actually going on to the disservice of everybody.
Yeah. Okay, fascinating. So if you have questions for folks on the panel, please post them. And Erica, I'm going to ask you to watch for those. And I don't know how you feel about coming on and asking them, because I am not good at multitasking. Or you could direct message me. But okay, great. Thanks, Erica. So I want to ask Amelia one more question before we go to the questions. And that is, Amelia, as you meet with people and listen to what they need to improve life, what the barriers are to that, and you think about, okay, here's what my newsroom needs to do. You are in a different place from a lot of other journalists in the newsroom who are, I think Andre referred to it as feeding the beast, and they are on a fast track. And I don't want you to throw your newsroom under the bus, because I know that this is going on in the industry. What would you say to newsrooms that they need to do to be aware of what you know?
Well, one thing is that we are not experts on the community. The community is experts on itself. And the way we learn about the community is to talk to the community. I have community outreach in my job description title and all that. But all of us have a responsibility to engage with real people and not just rely on the data and the points on a chart or whatever. We have to actually go out and talk to people and be a part of the community. there, and I'm gonna get really, really on my soapbox if I keep going, but there's an important reason that, you know, our craft is mentioned in our most sacred national document is because it's an important craft and we have to take that seriously. And the way we do that is to really A, care about our communities, and B, connect with our communities and reflect them in ways that are meaningful to them. And that soapbox is all, I'm off the soapbox now, so.
I will add that at the Akron Beacon Journal, we facilitated community conversations that exposed landlords and rental rates as a major problem. And people said affordable housing is one of our biggest issues. And that's not something that reporters with college degrees and mortgages think about. And it created a whole interest in, let's get to database of landlords and looking at who the landlords are and who has the most violations against them, who does the most foreclosures. And it created an exploration that, and a collaboration among newsrooms that would never have happened unless newsrooms agreed to sit down together and hold community conversations and listen to what's on people's minds. It drives what data that you, it drives the data that you seek, as opposed to what college educated, often white males think that we need to get to tell a story. Okay, so I'm being directed to Megan's comments. I'm a coalition director, not a journalist. I hear from citizens every day who find stories through public records that are pretty incredible, and they have nowhere to get the word out. Journalists sometimes aren't interested if it isn't a big or impactful case. Okay, they think the citizen is a crackpot. Who wants, and as a managing editor, I took calls like that all the time, and I didn't have good answers. Well, who wants to try that one?
I can take it. I would love if people called me up and said, we found this great story in these public records. And we do sometimes emails make their way up to me because a reporter, you know, someone reached out to a reporter and they want a second opinion on things. And, you know, the kind of sad reality, and we see this in our newsroom, is the list of stories that we want to do is 10 times longer than what we'll ever get around to doing. So I know that that's a factor in looking at some of these pitches that we get from people. You know, we have to kind of look at it as, is this something that's going to, and we say big or impactful, I like to think of it more as, is this going to speak to a certain audience in our community or highlight a problem? Or is this going to help, you know, is this going to prompt a solution? Because I will say that stories like this, or, you know, kind of really interesting lawsuits, or those actually are really great stories for us. We love, you know, there's like a neighbor conflict that makes its way into small claims court, and some, you know, we've written about a couple of those in the last year that have huge interest and or have prompted some sort of change. I think just from my personal experience, it's not so much that it's, you know, that we think they're a crackpot. It's just sometimes it's the actual story there is bigger than we can get our arms around too. And I know that there's been pitches that I started looking into, you know, what the person was relaying to me, and I looked at the public documents, and the public documents didn't really hold up the story that was being pitched. And you know, I either went back and asked for more information, or tried to find people to talk to, or decided that it just was something that we wouldn't be able to wrap our arms around to tell as a complete story.
Anybody else want to tackle that one?
I think sometimes it also depends on, I think it depends a lot on the size of the newsroom and on how they view impact. Because I know impact has become a really big thing to measure in recent years. impactful, and it could also be a matter of who you're reaching out to. Because if you're reaching out to an organization that still tends to act more national, despite the fact that you may think that they're more regional or local, in their mind, something that could have an impact in a local community is not going to be big enough and impactful for a larger national news organization. Because in their minds, they aren't seeing transformational change across the country or across an issue. They're seeing it as, oh, it's going to help this one part of this one community. So that's something that is something I have seen in the last few years, is that sometimes it's maybe helping folks figure out which news organization they should be reaching out to. So I got two more here based on this panel discussion today, and and thinking about how we provide that information to an organization and seeing how they can handle it because of the capacity.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious. I wish we could talk to Megan to find out which story she was trying to pitch, so we can maybe steal some of those stories.
Yes.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Amelia. Mhm.
Yeah, that's all I'm gonna say. But like, really, my job is to sort of get people in the paper. Their viewpoints is not news, it's views, but it's also based in truth. It has to be based in facts. Perspectives are, driven from things that actually happened. So, but I just really would have liked to have more information about the stories that she has pitched or her colleagues have. So.
To Megan, Amelia and Jackie represent Gannett, which has news organizations all over the country, and they are changing their approach. And if they see something that might be a trend, there's an opportunity. So, share with Amelia, and she can share, or try the closest Gannett paper, because they share ideas of things they're pursuing. But I'm going to add something here that's going to make both of them a little nervous, and that is that they have limited resources, and they are looking for the big issues that will resonate with the most people. There are opportunities in the news ecosystem for startups. I truly believe that there are wonderful people who are experimenting with new news organizations that serve neighborhoods, communities, marginalized communities, that can tell stories in ways that the larger organizations cannot. One of the people I love is a person who runs a low power radio station in Cleveland. And he was part of a collaborative of news organizations producing some powerful stories. And he said, but I will tell the story to my people. You will not do it. I know how to deliver that story. You don't. And that's what's really interesting about the news ecosystem, that there are those opportunities. So if, Megan, there is a story that's not being told, there are ways to say, let's sit down and talk about how we can tell this story ourselves through theater, by getting on the public radio, by finding a low power radio station that will tell our story. There are lots of opportunities, and it requires being very creative, maybe even talking at church. So Erica, how are we doing on time? I think we need to finish up in 3 minutes. Okay, so there's anybody on the panel want to add anything before we finish up? No? All right, so I have led a collaborative for the last few years that has made the case that journalism is the problem. And it has come from our downsizing, from our being different from the people we cover. We have lost connections, and you're seeing people on this panel who are trying to rebuild those connections. Journalists have to be in this with their communities, being real people. listening to the people in the communities and trying to help them improve, as opposed to saying, here's why your community is falling apart. And all of that goes back to the information we seek and how we present it. Big questions. And I think we're all here to save the world in our own way, right? All right, so I'm gonna call this to a close, and Erica, I hope you've saved all this because I want to read it. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. All right, good night, everybody.